Hello, Kevin.
Yes.
How are you, my friend? This is Ken.
Hey, Ken. How you doing?
Good, buddy. Really appreciate your taking time to talk with me. I'm a big fan of your work. Followed it all the way back to Whole Earth. And
Whole Earth. Oh, yeah, man.
Oh, yeah. And Wired, of course, Out of Control, New Rules, Technium, with a lot of appreciation, great admiration.
Thank you.
Well, my pleasure. Your insights are central and right at the crossroads of humanity, spirituality, technology, economics, evolution, and so on.
Oh, dear. Well, I'm sorry, but I'm just trying my best to make sense of the world. So as you are as well. So
Indeed.
I'm looking forward to our conversation.
What I thought we might do is as a prolific producer of ideas, there's any number of ways we could do this thing, but I thought one of the simplest and maybe most fun for both of us would be for me to take some of your blog writings on the Technium and read sections of that and then pause, and then we can discuss the central ideas and insights in each of those sections.
Okay.
How's that? Would you try that for a start?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's start with one on the cosmic origins of extropy, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. And it starts, technology is the visible extension of an archaic force which runs up in time while the universe runs down. Technology is the latest chapter in a continuous story that builds up order, structure, freedom, possibilities, and good against the inescapable black drain of entropy. While the universe cools and dies, the spreading differential of life and technology warms up a greater portion of cosmic coldness. The rising flow, called extropy, enlivens our current technology on Earth, but was first birthed in the unlikely genesis of the universe 12 billion years ago. In that way, all machines trace their origins to the Big Bang. Technology is a cosmic force. That's a really kind of stunning view.
Yeah, I have to say that that's also a minority view.
Yes.
And not too many people are combining words cosmic and technology together in the same sentence.
Right.
So I am heartened that you appreciate the sensibility, but it ain't mainstream.
Yeah. Well, I have my own belief about technology is that it basically goes all the way up and all the way down. And seeing this view is in consonance with my own. I realize we're both a little bit of mavericks on this side of the street. Your blog continues, as primeval matter swirled into galaxies, extropy rose as stuff gathered into life and finally unleashed its full power as self-consciousness, mindfulness. Extropy is now unfolding the Technium, the autonomous planetary technological system created by our minds. It is this awakening sphere of technology which is so altering our planet, shaping our history, and disturbing the universe. So it really is, that view puts technology really central to the universe and to being human, doesn't it?
It does. And later on, not in that post, but later on in my post, I also make the point that humanity itself is being self-defined by technology, that technology, that we aren't separate from it, that it's part and parcel of us, and so our very humanity is being defined, but we are also part of a much larger story, that kind of a grand evolutionary story from the Big Bang, and that these things that we all find so not only interesting but vital, life, intelligence, mind, consciousness, and now technology, are all examples of a larger class of things. I would call extropic systems, and other people might have other names. And so we're part of a very big story going on that's expanding into the universe. And I think when we wrestle with questions about which technologies should we adopt, I think it's important that we maintain that longer-term view of where technology has come from and where it's going.
Right.
And that's not even to... Well, I mean, in addition to that, we can also go into issues about the meaning of our lives, and I think my suspicion is that technology has a role in the meaning of life, and that's what I'm interested in is what is the meaning of technology.
Right. And, of course, we see that going back, you speak of technology helping to define what it is to be human itself, and this is something that is a recurrent theme in your work, and it's a recurrent theme in important thinking. And we can see this, we go back to human epics of development or evolution itself, from foraging to horticultural to agrarian to industrial to informational. And at each of those epochs, technology was, whether recognized or not, really central to how human beings define themselves. And part of how they define spirit, if they had such a conception, part of how they define their interactions, part of how they define their meaning on Earth. And so it's just now becoming the sort of central role of technology in doing all of that. It's just now becoming sort of self-conscious. It's not that just now technology is starting to do this stuff. It's that just now we're starting to recognize how it's always done this stuff.
Exactly. And, I mean, yeah, one is we become conscious of technology sort of at the very moment when it's slightly becoming conscious of itself.
Right.
And that's the next big step, of course.
Right. Huxley said that in humans, evolution became conscious of itself. Right. And that's sort of the first step to artifacts of humans becoming conscious, possibly, and then becoming conscious of themselves. Right. And that's a whole topic we'll get into as we go on, which is the whole relation of technology to consciousness and whether consciousness can, in fact, be, quote, downloaded into artifacts, into technology. Right. Because you've got so many interesting points on that. Finishing this blog, you say everything we find interesting and good in the cosmos, living organisms, civilization, communities, intelligence, evolution itself, has a strong hand of entropy running through it. While the cosmic background slips away to its eternal rest, the energy coursing through these systems flings forward an unbroken sequence of ever unlikely existences. By the normal calculus of entropy, the appearance of both kangaroos and 747 should be impossible, and yet their unlikely existences and the surprising appearance of any extropic organization that stands upright in the stream of heat death serves as a platform for yet newer ways to continue the story of unlikely possibilities. Alfred North Whitehead said there was sort of one primordial fact of the universe, and that was, quote, its undeniable advance into creative novelty. So that speaks against entropy and for these extropic systems that you're talking about.
Exactly.
Our global technium is the current stage of the story. It is the mythic midpoint between a cascade of extropic organization reaching back to the genesis of the universe and forward to an unseen next. Here I'm certainly agreeing with you again that the technium technology goes all the way up and all the way down. If we follow the trajectory of this very long continuum, it suggests not only a future, but a destiny as well. It is a course in which we humans will play a role, but we are still determining our exact role. At every stage in this long continuum, choices are expanded, and freedom to be is enlarged. That's also quite a stunning view.
And very optimistic.
Very up, yeah, it is. And to that extent, probably also a little bit outside of mainstream.
Yes.
A little bit maverick shot, but I think it holds true. And I think we see it in human evolution as well, including present-day development. Developmental psychologists see human development occurring in stages or waves, and each stage is marked by an increase in freedom, an increase in the number of degrees, the number of perspectives that a human being can take. Right. So it goes from being able to take just a first-person perspective and being very narcissistic to being able to take a second-person perspective and being ethnocentric to being able to take a third-person perspective and be world-centric. And each of those stages is an increase in freedom, an increase in consciousness, an increase in care, increase in capacity for love.
Right. So what I'm kind of focusing on is there a fourth-person perspective?
Yes.
And I think that's where we're sort of headed right now.
Yeah.
And what that means.
I think that's exactly right. And it's a meta-perspective towards all the perspectives that have come so far.
Right.
And so that's why we're doing just what we're doing now, which is sitting here and saying, what does this mean? And as you also point out in several of these blogs, probably one of the defining questions of the next century, so defining it's likely to become available on evening news, is what does it mean to be human?
Mm-hmm.
Because even reflecting on something like that was, taken as previously such a simple question as to hardly be worth asking, has, because of the increasing advances of the Technium, started to change the very nature of humanity itself, what it means to be human, what the possibilities are.
Right. It hasn't started. I mean, it has all along. We've been redefining ourselves, and all that's happening is we're a little more conscious that we're now redefining ourselves.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of more self-conscious redefinition. And that, coincidentally, sort of happens at the moment when basically we're confronting other consciousness.
Right.
And so it becomes very perplexing and becomes very trying to us because suddenly several things happen. And one is we realize, oh my gosh, we've always been redefining ourselves. Oh my gosh, we're now conscious of redefining ourselves. We have a new responsibility. And then thirdly, oh my gosh, there's other consciousness involved.
Right.
And so it's like, what do we want to be?
Yeah.
Not only who are we, but what do we want to be who we are? And so all these things are sort of happening, and that makes this time to be alive an incredibly amazing moment. Right. And there aren't too many times in the history of a civilization when they go through this. And so here we are.
Yeah,
we're alive right now.
I think that's exactly right. And if you look at even the essential basic chunked technological eras that go from foraging to horticultural to agrarian to industrial to informational, that's only 5 major shifts in techno-economic modes. Right. And for us to be going through one of those right now is astonishing and, again, incredibly rare. And it does involve, as you perceptively pointed out, the emergence on an increasing scale of a fourth-person perspective, of a meta-perspective on all of these things that have come prior. And that perspective is being driven especially by the Technium, especially by technological advances in science. And so that's why the work you're doing and the roles that you've played is sort of, right at the central nexus of all of these issues, which is why it's such a fascinating trail of ideas that you leave behind you, let us say. And also this notion then that the last sentence in this blog, at every stage in this long continuum, choices are expanded and freedom to be is enlarged, is a particular reading or interpretation of evolution as well, and also then impacts on our definition or notions or ideas about God. And the next blog that I want to read from goes directly to that and is called The Evolutionary Mind of God. And I'd like to read a fair amount of this and then discuss as we go along, because these are all, I think, just absolutely crucial issues and will increasingly come to be asked and discussed in the common culture, and not just something for philosophers or, professional elite thinkers to get into. And let me also kind of preface reading some of this by saying that, in my own view, we have these 3 general perspectives or dimensions that are available to human beings. The first person, which is the person who is speaking, second person, which is the person who's being spoken to, and the third person, which is the person or thing being spoken about. And because of that, in the emergence of this fourth person perspective, we can look at anything through those 3 perspectives. And I think those 3 perspectives are all real, are all equally important, and none of them can be reduced to the others. And so we need to sort of keep that in mind as we approach any topic. And it's true, I think, for spirituality as well. There's a third person approach to God, which sees God as a third-person objective entity like the great web of life or the whole universe as a system or a substance, indeed very much like pantheism. And that is one of the main topics of this blog. There's also a second-person approach to spirit, and that's sort of more common in theistic traditions, and that's to imagine that what if the actual creator, designer of this extraordinary system, this Gaia, this great web of life, this extraordinary universe, what if the creator of that was alive and sitting in the chair right in front of you? There was an actual second-person embodiment or manifestation of spirit. And that second person would, of course, be described in you or thou terms. And spirituality would be a case of I-thou relationship then. And then there's also a possibility of first-person relationship to spirituality. And this would define God or spirit in first-person terms. In other words, I, or I-amness, or I am that I am, or the supreme identity, the Sufis call it, or Buddha nature, Buddha mind, and actually sees spirit as the pure consciousness or pure awareness, the I that is aware of everything that's arising. And everything that's arising is but a manifestation of this one mind. And so there are all the three of these perspectives that can be taken on any event, and I think also can be taken on spirituality. So one of the things we're doing here in this blog is discussing some of the objective aspects of spirituality and discussing it in third-person terms, it terms. And so I sort of with that prologue, I mean, does that make sense? Just kind of a general...
Yeah. I think the thing about third, second, first, and even fourth perspectives is that while we talk about it, we have to sort of talk about it in one person, but it's very possible and likely that all three perspectives are true.
Right.
And so you can put on your set of glasses, and so we can talk about the spiritual from the first person, while the second, third, and fourth are also true. And
right.
So what's interesting about if we take the extension of kind of this evolutionary extropic sense of the unfolding universe as a divine act, then the interesting question, which your intro is sort of hinting at, is what would happen if you took that in a first-person view?
Right.
And I think that's one of the things that I'm trying to explore, and that we're doing sort of inadvertently, is to say I am technology.
Right.
In other words, if this is the divine force, then I am technology. I am part of this thrust. And in that sense, you can say, well, you're demeaning yourself because you're thinking of yourself as a machine, and I'm thinking, no, I'm elevating myself,
right.
myself as a machine, and that basically it's kind of enlarging the circle of empathy, because I'm saying the difference between me and the machine is not as much as we think. We have a little bit of kind of parochial thinking right at this moment, because machines are kind of still very primitive, but eventually we won't.
Right.
And I think that if we make that switch and to say, I am the stream, I am this extropic force
right.
unfolding, I think that does several things in reorienting our view of what technology means in the world. And if thinking of technology as something that is a pulse of goodness in the universe is certainly not mainstream. Thinking of ourselves
right.
as that is even further away, and we have a long way to go before there's a church larger than one here. Two.
But it does make it, if we look at technology as being, among other things, artifacts that are objective and are created by any sentient being. So the Technium artifact includes a bird's nest, an anthill, any coral reef, anything's created by sentient beings that are third-person objects.
Right, but I want to say that's the beginning. But also I want to make sure that we all understand that technology is not just artifacts, objects. That there are methods and intangibles. It's actually technology is a type of structured change. It's a method of learning. It's a type of thinking in the broadest sense of the word.
Right.
And so we tend to identify them as objective objects, and they are objective, but they're not always objects.
Exactly. And there's in a sense, a quote ontology, a realness to technology, whether it appears in first, second, or third person perspectives. But it also then, in terms of third-person perspective, in just even a traditional Christian view that would see the world as the body of Christ, or then technology can indeed be viewed as part of the body of spirit and a particular communication, a particular systems interaction, a particular component of spirit itself.
Right, yeah. So if you kind of, crudely reduce that, saying, well, technology is the body of God.
Right.
You wouldn't be too far off, but man, this is not commonly understood, because most people say, well, technology is the body of the devil.
Exactly.
So I think, I think what we haven't talked about, which is the normal objections about, where do the evils of technology, where do they fit into this little schema? And that's the common objection. However, that's in parallel to the general question of the role of evil in the world.
Well, yes, and it does. Part of what we'll get into when we get into this blog is just that, is discuss the ways we can talk about evil in this world. Right. And one of the things that a broad-based pantheism has done, as one of the three general approaches to thinking about spirit that you outline here, one of the things that pantheism has at least forced thinkers to consider is the possibility that both good and evil are somehow part of an all-embracing one.
Right.
And therefore things that had previously thought to be evil, in some case like technology, are in fact expressions of a deeper good. Right. And that it's up to humanity to make those distinctions as to whether technology is used for good or for evil. And it's not something inherent in technology itself to be inherently evil or inherently bad or inherently alienating. And I think that's a big change in how the modern and postmodern world has been able to look at technology.
Yeah, well, on this point, I would like to push that a little bit, because I'm actually making a stronger statement. I think the common stance that technology is neutral, I think, is a little wrong. We wouldn't say, well, life is neutral.
Right.
We would say life is good.
Right.
We don't say mind is neutral. Mind is good. I'm saying something a little bit stronger. I'm saying technology is good. I'm saying it's inherently good.
Got it.
That the more technology we have, the better. And so, just as we say, the more life there is, the better. So there are aspects of natural biology and stuff that causes harm. AIDS virus, whatever it is, that is present. And so there are examples of harm, and there's examples of reduction of freedom and reduction of options in nature, but we say life is good. And I think the same thing. So I wanted to stress that it's not just neutral, it's actually inherently good.
Yeah, and I think that is a statement that holds up across different perspectives. So it holds true not just for humans, it holds true for the Technium in general, which goes all the way down, which goes all the way back to the Big Bang. And the Technium is simply one way of looking at, one perspective, one dimension of this totality of unfolding being.
Right.
And that in itself is good.
Right.
And I'm totally with you on that, and it's as true for birds and building bird nests as humans building computers.
Right.
And it's a fundamental goodness about it that is part of the essential fundamental goodness of manifestation, we could say.
Right.
So now that we get to thinking about spirit and ways to think about God, and we think about it first, second, and third person, think about it as all of those encapsulated in the emerging fourth person perspective. But you touch on several of these important issues, so I want to just jump in and read some of these. The evolutionary mind of God. Because first we come to the difficulties of representing God or spirit in intellectual terms. There is no human-created description of God that is without contradiction. Any minimal definition of God we can conjure up entails multiple infinities, such as omnipotence, omniscience, or eternal existence. However, when a being is infinite in all directions, the infinitudes cross and begin to contradict each other. The schoolyard riddle that asks if God could make a stone so heavy he can't lift it is just one simple case of how infinite capacity is muddled when one's infinitudes are pitted against each other. The many other inherent paradoxes of God pointed out by theologians usually rest in these battling infinite dimensions. How can a being be infinitely just and infinitely merciful? How can it be boundlessly omniscient and free-willed? And if God is defined as less than infinite, even in a few dimensions, then it becomes a God few want to honor, since humans, even in our lesser minds, can imagine a greater God, one who is infinite in all directions, even though this God as defined is full of contradictions. This discussion takes God at its most naked and leaves out the extra burdens of religious clothing. But that is a difficulty in trying to have a finite mind define a multitude of infinities. So as you point out here, God, cannot be all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good. Or, for example, he wouldn't allow Auschwitz. He can be two of those three. He can be all-knowing and all-powerful if he's not all-good. Or he can be all-good and all-powerful if he's not all-knowing. But as soon as you acknowledge all three, you have contradictions. And so you continue, but any description of the universe without God, and this is to take the second major stance that you discuss here. The first is the general theistic stance and the contradictions in it. But the second major stance, any description of the universe without God is also compromised with contradictions. How does existence begin with no beginning? If the universe is deterministic, what determines its first motion? In a field of infinities, why is anything at all finite? And so these contradictions, of course, are gleefully overlooked by atheists. Then you state one is left with the conclusion that both God and no God are impossible, at least to our limited human minds. Both possibilities could, of course, simply be beyond human comprehension, and their inherent contradictions, so apparent to us, could be resolved by intellects greater than ours. Indeed, some theists who assert the reality of God counter contradictions by claiming God is ineffable, that is, unknowable by us, and therefore has no definition. This seems like a cop-out to the atheists who assert that the reality of no God is at least definable. Atheists counter the contradictions in their own view by claiming our ignorance and inabilities can be overcome via science. In a recent blaze of publicity and attention, atheists have come out of the shadows in contemporary culture and are denouncing a religion of gods and promoting the superior perspective of no God as a view that should appeal to the modern and technologically oriented. And it has. Nerds and techies find the scientific approach of current atheism extremely appealing. And that's, of course, discussing Hawkins, Sam Harris, Chris Hutchinson, and so on. But recently a third way of imagining the ground of being has emerged, which is also very appealing to techies. It stems from one of the most ancient theologies, but this ancient orientation is being rejuvenated by scientific and technological understandings. Judged from my own discussions with educated and rational people, this third view is more appealing to them than the blankness of atheism, and I suspect in the long run more likely to gain allegiance of those who can't make that leap into a belief of God. This new third way is a type of pantheism. The orthodox definition of God, God transcends the universe. The universe in this view is a creation issuing from God. The universe has the same relation to God as a story or painting would to us. As authors, we transcend our masterpiece. While the universe reflects the nature of its creator, it is decidedly other. The furthest of the two, creator and creation, might be entwined is into a duality like a body and soul. We might say the author was the soul of the work. In Augustine's metaphor from the 4th century, the universe is the body for God's soul. In atheism, there is, of course, no duality. The universe simply is. But pantheism, at least in its revived form, offers a concept of godhood with unity. There are many historical varieties of pantheism, but most could fairly be summed up in a literal translation and description. all God. Creation and God are not separate. All is one. The philosophers of pantheism like to say that rather than God transcending the universe, God is eminent in the universe. Mystics since the dawn of consciousness have claimed to be awakened to the startling fact that since the universe is God, each of us contains God, or even more shocking, is God. God is everywhere we look. And so this is indeed a startling third alternative to the other two, and is indeed starting to catch on. Thoughts on that, reflections on that?
Well, I think I'm an amateur philosopher. I'm an amateur theologian. So, listening to myself here, I realize that there's probably a lot more to say about it. But I think as a rough approximation that this is what's happening. I think there is first of all, one of the things that's really true about this domain that we're in is that there's a lot of baggage of centuries that's carried forth with some of these words. And so the word pantheism, it carries a lot of weight from former uses of it. And so I suspect that, if it were to catch on, it would catch on by a different name. It would be recast in more contemporary vocabulary, and that's in effect what I'm trying to do. Is that I'm trying to infuse some of the thinking about these very big questions with the new vocabulary around science and technology, because I believe that they have far, belief in science. I think has far more in common than the normal debates would allow them to have.
Right.
And I think part of our inability to imagine them having an overlap or maybe even being in parallel is because we don't have a sufficient vocabulary. And so this was sort of an attempt to frame it in a unified set of metaphors. And, I welcome, it's a first stab. I'm not going to convince anybody with that argument. I think people far more versed in this stuff have to make something that's a little bit more emotional and have more of a narrative. But I think that I see us headed, us meaning collectively as a society, headed in the direction of having this conversation in these terms. So, I don't know where in the kind of the world of the religious, they're not having this conversation, and I don't think the world of scientists are having this conversation either.
Right.
But I think we could have that conversation.
Yeah, so do I. And the ones that are having this particular type of conversation are ones that are scientifically oriented, in my experience, but that have had direct spiritual experience and know that these type of some sort of spiritual flavor makes absolute sense for the universe, and in fact seems just almost impossible to deny. And that tends to be the conviction that spiritual experiences convey. And my understanding is that when you were 27, you had just that type of experience. Isn't that right?
Yes, that's true.
Can we talk a little bit about that? It was
sure.
Yeah, you were in one of your Earth-traveling vagabond modes, and had run out of money and ended up sleeping in what was purported to be the place of Christ's crucifixion.
Right.
And as you awoke that morning, had a very profound experience that has not only stayed with you, but been a crucial component of your own outlook on life. Yeah,
exactly. So, I went to Asia instead of going to college, and I, as a photographer, self-designated photographer, recording the vanishing traditions of Asia, I spent a lot of time at religious ceremonies where most of the color is, so to speak, and went to Zen temples, went to Buddhist retreats, went to the Hindu Kumbh Mela, I mean the Valley of Gods in Kulu. I mean, Tibet. I've been everywhere. And so I'd gone to Jerusalem with the same attitude, the same perspective of there, headed there for Easter, and so it was another photo opportunity.
Right.
And unexpectedly, I had a religious conversion on Easter morning, and I think I wasn't looking for it, which is one indication to me that it was probably real, and two, funnily, once I had it, it didn't change my life immediately, and that was another curious aspect because I'd always thought that if it came, I would instantly be transformed. And I think thirdly, this wasn't a matter of, I'm a very intellectual person, kind of brainy, and so what was surprising to me was sort of the way in which this was not a matter of, it was my brain that sort of had to finally acknowledge this.
Yeah.
And that was the last holdout and it did not come through logic. It was not a logical thing. To believe that Jesus Christ was God is not, you don't get there only by logic.
Right.
But yet I still had to, my brain still had to make that journey. And so that experience, again, of a type of knowledge that is not transmittable by falsifiable hypothesis.
Right.
Yet still has to, if it's real, has to be subjected to that. I think it has retained because it was an experiential thing. So the foundation of Western science is actually based on the idea that when we can doubt everything else, this is Cartesian idea, when we can doubt everything else, we have to start with the idea of the one thing we can't doubt,
right,
which is our own existence. So because I am doubting, because I doubt, therefore I know that there's an I.
Right.
The phrase should really be, I doubt, therefore I am.
Right.
But that's sort of confusing in English. And so it's because I'm skeptical of all these things, and that I know that there's something there that's skeptical, and that therefore the one thing I can't doubt is the fact that there's somebody who's skeptic. And so that experiential center, my experience of faith is what I rest upon. And it seemed to me that it's as valid as the experience of no God.
Right.
And so, that has made me aware mostly of different world perspectives that I have a sympathy for the other and the other views, because this view is in certain places a minority view. Other places, of course, is a majority view.
Right.
But I am aware of the fact that there are things like worldviews that are full of assumptions and are usually unexamined. And so, if anything, I've made it a practice to examine my assumptions.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it follows the contours of spiritual experience as the mystics report it the world over. Yeah. And that's clearly also a first-person kind of knowledge. You're not knowing it in a third-person, stand-aside, objective, kind of descriptive, falsifiable type of knowledge, but as a first-person, direct, immediate, existentially revealed consciousness, therefore being. And I can doubt everything else out there. I can doubt my senses. I can doubt even images in my mind, but I can't doubt that which is aware of those things. Right. And so that is really kind of a form of Western Vedanta, and where the Atman, the pure witness in a human, is said to be one with Brahman, one with the absolute ground of all being.
Right.
And known in a direct, first-person, immediate fashion. And that's a kind of knowledge that is unfortunately taken to be, not only outside of science, but just not scientific, just anti-scientific even. And that's one of the really unfortunate things that comes with that type of spirituality, and I think is also one of the important types of spirituality that doesn't, as often as it should, get talked about in these discussions of will spiritual machines come into existence? Can human beings, create spiritual machines by 2100? Will we down, that kind of thing? Because what generally is meant by spiritual there is just conscious. And it doesn't take into account at least these two dramatically different forms of consciousness. One's sort of relative, small mind, finite consciousness, and the other being, a big mind, absolute, supreme identity consciousness. And if we're going to download humanity into machines, I'm going to make sure at least both of those kinds of knowledge get on the table for getting downloaded.
Right. I have a lot of skepticism and I would say even criticisms of the Ray Kurzweil, the spiritual machine author, his idea of singularity. But I actually like his use of the word spiritual machines, or the combination of those two, because, again, this is a very minority maverick view, but I believe actually that some of the greatest advance that we're going to see in the world in the future in a unifying or the convergence of a scientific view and a spiritual view will come from machines. It will come when we begin to make other types of intelligences. And see, the thing where I disagree with Ray is I think there's absolutely zero reason to make an artificial human brain. First of all, we can't do that because the matrix, the substrate of what a mind is made with matters. There is not a separate duality that the matter in which something is happening makes a difference, and that the only way you can make a mind that thinks and behaves like a human mind is to make it with exactly the same kind of tissues.
Right.
And there's no reason to do that because we can do that so easily in 9 months right now. But what we can't do with tissue is to make different kinds of minds, different kinds of intelligences, and ultimately different kinds of consciousness. And that will depend on how we make things. And so, we can make machines that are smarter than us right now in many different dimensions, but they're very narrow and they're not conscious, or very little consciousness. And so, but eventually we will. And as we do that, we will begin to inevitably see spirits, see the spirit aspect of these things, because right now they're just too small. They're too small-minded. They aren't big-minded enough to hold that. But as they become bigger, more complex, more advanced, more sophisticated, more evolved, they will begin to have room. And then we will, for the first time, begin to understand that these are real phenomena and that we have to use the language of science to understand this. And I think that's a very exciting time, because I think it's actually spiritual machines that will redeem and rejuvenate human spirituality.
Right. Well, it's certainly just even the phrase itself speaks towards a non-dual understanding of reality, which is that which has traditionally been thought to be antagonistic or opposite from each other, or separate or set apart, in fact, are two aspects of one living something. And it's that spirit and machines go together. They're spiritual machines or mechanical spirit, doesn't matter. And that has to do with, again, this upgrading of an understanding of Technium. Understanding that is this manifestation of spirit itself.
Right. So there is the traditional aphorism that we're not humans on a spiritual journey. We're actually spiritual beings on a human journey. And I think we'll understand the same thing about machines in a certain sense, is that we're all on a spiritual journey, and that there are Some of us will be humans and some will be, non-human.
Right.
And as obviously there must be other beings in the world who aren't human as well. But I think this is more than just sort of coincidental or a byproduct. I think this chore or achievement or a task of creating alternative consciousness and alternative spirituality is actually part of the main event. That this is actually part of what evolution is about. This is part of what the universe is about. This is part of what the trophic system is about, which is to actually inhabit the world with all possible minds, with all possible spirits, and that only by having the 99 billion varieties of godhood, of thinking, of awareness, can we hope to begin to kind of grasp at the meaning of the universe.
Right.
So in other words, it's going to take the collective assembly, the collective aggregate of all minds to understand God.
Right. Right. And I think that's a really important point. I think that one of the ways that shows up is in, again, studies of developmental psychology, because what we learn there is that human worldviews tend to unfold and develop, and not in any prefixed, Platonic, ordained way, but just that this is the way that historically worldviews have unfolded, and they tend to be carried with us, not necessarily in a Lamarckian fashion, but just even in cultural memory. And Gene Gebser, who was one of the first to look at this evolution of worldviews, had terms for the major levels of unfolding that are sort of self-explanatory, and so they're easy to use. And the terms were archaic to magic to mythic to rational to pluralistic to integral and higher. And one of the problems that we have with religion, with spirituality, is that it itself runs that entire line. There's archaic religion, there's magic religion, there's mythic religion, there's rational religion, there's pluralistic religion, there's integral religion. And one of the main distinctions is there is also the higher stages of that developmental scale are trans-rational, whereas the lower stages are pre-rational. And not to judge any of them as absolutely better or worse than the others, but simply to say that because there is this increasing consciousness, increasing expansion of freedom, increasing expansion of perspectives that development tends to give human beings, that trans-rational religion, trans-rational spirituality, tends to be that kind of spirituality we find at the core of the great contemplative traditions. So whether that's contemplative Christianity and the early Desert Fathers, aiming to have this consciousness be in you, which was in Christ Jesus, that we all may be one, or whether it's the Vedanta notion of Brahman and Atman, or whether it's the Sufi notion of supreme identity of the soul and Godhead, that trans-rational form of spirituality is quite different from the magic and mythic forms, which are pre-rational and tend to be ethnocentric and tend to have to do with a chosen people and a chosen path, and my path is real and is the only correct path, and everybody else's path is wrong, incorrect, infidels. And one of the difficulties is for us to distinguish those two broad categories and to realize that individuals that are doing contemplative, experimental, phenomenological, introspective types of spirituality are different from those who are proclaiming a particular dogma, a particular mythological feat that you have to believe in, or else you're going to hell. Not that that is anything wrong with that as a worldview, but just that, along the religious developmental line itself, there are so many different worldviews, and particularly these two broad chunks that relate in comparison to science as being pre-rational science and post-rational science. So, in other words, the trans-rational spiritual paths can very easily be integrated with rational science,
right,
because they transcend but include them.
right.
And I think that is one of the things that we're going to get from this increasing scientific understanding of an alternative view of spirit as being pantheistic or panentheistic. And one of the problems that slows down that realization is the widespread presence of fundamentalism and traditionalism. This is, after all, what the new atheists, the Sam Harrises and the Richard Dawkins, go nuts over, is, the belief that the world was created in 6 days. Moses really did part the Red Sea, and Mary really was a biological virgin, and so on. And that type of belief is very common in magic and mythic religious structures, but it's not common at all in practices of meditation and contemplation and transcendental awakening that we find in the great contemplative traditions. And so I think one of the things that might start to happen is that the orientation of the contemplative practices, the mystical practices, as opposed to the dogmatic practices, the practices dependent upon direct mystical experiences, as opposed to ones dependent upon a simple belief. I think that kind of awakening might start coming with this spiritual machine approach.
Right. Exactly. Because right now there is a little bit of a speciesism among, say, the people who tend to, say, adhere or at least to support that the kind of mystical transcendental view are often very eager and avid humanists. They really
right.
value the value of the human condition and the
right.
human challenge, and they are often not sympathetic to the idea that machines can do this.
Right.
So,
right.
and in fact, they see a lot of the mechanical aspects of the world as promoting or at least encouraging kind of this fundamental view of the world.
Right.
And so I think there is I think we're headed for a kind of a very, very noticeable friction at some point between the technologists who may be making these things and the mystics who say, well, machines can't do this. So I'm imagining that kind of one of the, a formative moment will be the day that there are protests in the streets with robots and placards saying, we are the children of God.
Right.
And the only thing that could have as much impact on that would be if we actually contacted an ET or something,
yeah.
and they came down. So this is the equivalent of sort of meeting another, meeting ET. I think probability is very low, but making conscious robots, I think, is very, very high. And
exactly. And there's also a reason to do that, as you pointed out, and we were just saying a minute ago, which is that's not simply cloning a traditional human brain.
Right.
That's actually making something different.
Right.
And there's a reason to do that.
Right.
And the encounter of that difference will be exactly, nearly equivalent to contacting an ET.
Right. And that act, actually, from my Christian perspective, that act of making this is actually the completion of the mandate from God, which is, okay, God is the creator. The creator makes things that, like us, that have free will, that can create. So what what creators do is they make other things that can create, that in some way leverage or amplify that this free will and creativity of the most basic, pure sense. And so for us to actually be in the image of God, we actually kind of need to go to the next level, to do the next recursive loop, which is to create beings that will surprise us. And that's our job.
Right.
Our job is to surprise God. And so part of that obligation is to create other things that will surprise us, that will surprise God.
Right.
And so this is not just sort of an option. This is the main assignment.
Right.
And to fill the world with these other creative beings that we unleash. But before we unleash, and this is the crucial thing, we need to give a conscience. We need to We need to train and we need to unleash their creativity with moral guidance.
Right.
And it's not a free for all. I mean that's the tree of good and evil. I mean that's what we have to do. We have to understand. We have to embed in that somehow or other. And that's the difficult part.
I'm with you on all of that, and all of that is indeed quite outside of mainstream. But I think that it all makes sense, and particularly looking at it from evolutionary perspectives, where each stage of evolution brings a new perspective into existence, brings a second person out of a first person, and a third person out of a second person, and now a fourth person out of a third person, and there will be fifth person perspectives out of fourth. And those are things that we appear to be right at the hub right now, where a third person perspective has been brought forth by spiritual evolution.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's to a point where evolution has become conscious of itself and is starting now to reproduce itself through the medium of human beings and their spiritual machines.
Mm-hmm.
And the spiritual machines will be ones that, as you've said, and by definition, are essentially different from the human beings. And how that happens, of course, is one of the questions that you deal with in these blogs that we might have a chance to get to. And that's what's the source of up-creation?
Uh-huh.
And in other words, where it does, how can you have a higher emerging out of a lower?
Yeah.
And the one answer is, well, it comes from nothing, and that's kind of a boring, stupid, I don't know answer. And another is, well, there's the higher has been embedded in the lower from the Big Bang, from the beginning, and just has a chance to unfold. So up creation is simply the coming into explicitness of an implicit higher dimension or higher awareness, higher intelligence that was there from the start. And so that notion of up-creation itself easily lends itself to the notion of a spirit or a God that is eminent in evolution itself.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how each stage of evolution, in fact, is a little bit bigger than the one that went before it.
Mm-hmm.
And you've written on this as well, and would, I'm guessing, find a spiritual interpretation of evolution to considerably help along the notion of up-creation.
Yeah, just to maybe further elucidate the idea of up-creation, which is that you can imagine up-creation very simply is if there was a brain, like a human brain, that was capable of actually making a brain, artificial brain, that was smarter than itself.
Yeah.
So if we were able to do that, that would be an example of up-creation. But we actually see up-creation in other simpler ways in natural history and evolution, in things like the superorganism.
Right.
In a ant, termite, bee colony, where you have a emergent level of intelligence and smartness that's greater than the individuals. So
right.
That's the typical view of a ant colony, is that the ant colony itself is smarter, more varied behavior, more sophisticated behavior, more complex behavior, longer, deeper than any of the intelligences of the ants themselves. And so the question is, where does that intelligence come from? If you can't find it in any of the individuals, it's almost magically appears, but we use the word emergent, but it's a very, we can explain this in a kind of very reductive scientific way, but it's, in my phrase, it's up-creation. It's creating something greater than the lower levels.
Right.
And it happens all the time in these extropic systems.
Right. And is, again, something that handsomely, coherently fits with the notion of evolution as a spiritual unfolding.
Right.
And with different dimensions of that spiritual unfolding, one of which, as an intrinsic dimension to it, is the Technium.
Right.
It goes all the way down to the Big Bang.
Right.
And is part of the manifest dimension of spirit itself. And that's an extraordinary view, incidentally, and is, even though I'll read a paragraph or two here where you talk about some evolutionary pantheism and some of its religious correlates, but that notion, tying the Technium in as a dimension of spirit and that going all the way down, that is new. That's a new addition to typical statements from Teilhard de Chardin to Aurobindo, and I think it's a really important contribution on the religious side of the street to discussion of what a spiritual evolution consists of. Mm-hmm. And one of the things it consists of is this dimension, this technium. The technium is a way that in the manifest universe, among many other things, what it does is it's a way that separate sentient beings are connected to each other and can communicate with each other. And that communication is one of the major accomplishments and feats of the technium, and it's one of the main reasons why the technium is not just third person, but has dimensions in first, second, and third person perspectives, but is a fundamental dimension of spirit itself and spirit in action in the world.
Yeah, I'd agree.
And so I think that's one of the absolutely fascinating aspects that we can draw from your work. And there's that paragraph or two on its relation to religious followers. Not surprisingly, this modern evolutionary pantheism has its religious followers. In Christian circles, one strand is known as process theology. In oversimplified terms, it describes God as a verb, as a process. God is not monumental entity, infinite in all directions, but rather is changing, or perhaps, although they don't use this word because it entails time, evolving itself. The earlier aversion to accepting a God less than infinite in all directions is overcome in part by the recent appreciation that an evolving God is superior to a static God. You tell me which God is greater, a God incapable of improvement or one constantly perfecting. Evolution is educating us to belatedly acknowledge the latter as the greater being, at least as far as our minds can grasp. Furthermore, in process theology, the inherent logical paradoxes of God are embraced as unavoidable, in somewhat the same way that Gödel's theorem reveals the inherent contradictions in any logical system as unavoidable. Like all definitions of God, evo-pantheism contains its own absurdities. In fact, technically, this perspective might be more accurately called panentheism, which means that believers want to keep their cake and eat it too. Christian theologians hold the view that God is simultaneously both transcendent, not of the universe, but eminent in the universe, in the person of Jesus Christ. By his own volition, the unbounded God limited himself into the form of the very tiny body of a man. On the other hand, Islam is one long argument against this idea of a transcendent God limiting itself to special eminence. It maintains Muhammad is not the eminence of God and prohibits his picture in defense of this temptation. Evo-pantheism is open to straight-up eminence. God is evolving itself, and that evolution is what we call the universe. In any event, either way, when we read that, we have got a way to have a transcendental God that is in some ways timeless and a material, manifest, concrete universe, that we have them together, and that we have them intimately correlated and, in a sense, codependent. And I think that's one of the major appeals that you're exploring in pantheism or panentheism, and particularly for the nerdy, geeky, techie, college-educated individual who simply cannot buy a merely mythic, personified God as separate from this universe and ruling it, pushing it around, giving it morality in a very strictly command and control fashion, the type of religion that they got from Sunday school and gave up on because it just doesn't fit reality as they know it. And yet a spiritual evolutionary spirit is one that makes much more sense to them. And I think also the more that it's understood that these spiritual evolutionary religions are based on spiritual experience, are based on, in a sense, an expanded empiricism, very scientific in that sense, makes it the type of spiritual training and belief and school that could indeed become part of tomorrow's religion.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there right now, as we speak, there are a few people like Michael Dowd, who is a itinerant, roaming, wandering preachers going around to churches in America, preaching the gospel of theistic evolution.
Right.
And I, in my own conversations with people in the evangelical circle, is that their belief, personal belief, is far more leaning towards embracing evolution than what is preached from the pulpit, and that I think that, it's very clear that that kind of evolutionary perspective, even in classical Orthodox Christianity, is very sympathetic to the Bible. And I suspect that in 50 years from now, people will look back on this argument within the, evangelical Christian church with the same perplexity that we look on the argument about indulgences.
Yeah.
It's like, what were they arguing about? I mean, how could there have ever been any, fight over this? Because it'll seem fairly obvious that the perspective you were just talking about, this kind of evolutionary sense of God, well, people will say, yeah, duh, that it fits in there. There's no problem here.
Right.
What were they really fighting about?
Right. As this joins forces with things like process theology, there's also a way to read into this handling up creation and handling the whole problem of emergence itself. And that is, as you're aware, in process theology, Alfred North Whitehead maintained that each moment was a subject that came into being, and it had feeling. It was a proto-experiential reality, and that this subject comes into being each moment and then passes away and is grasped by its successor, which is a new subject that comes into being in a novel fashion, prehends or fields the preceding subject, which then becomes an object, and passes into the past, passes into time. So you have a string of both causality, which is that each new subject, when it prehends the previous subject, is bound by it. And so there's a degree of causality to that. But it also emerges, and it emerges as part of this creative advance into novelty. So the emergence itself has a degree of creativity. And that degree of creativity is the degree of freedom that the particular individual sentient being brings into existence. And it's lower on the earlier stages of evolution and increases as evolution itself increases. So the amount of creativity and novelty brought into existence by a rock, for example, is very, very limited. And therefore, physicists can predict the location of a rock, barring unforeseen forces, 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now. Whereas they can't predict the location of a dog, 3 seconds later, due to the increasing amount of creativity and novelty in the biological cells as opposed to merely material atoms. And it's that kind of closing the gap between eminence and transcendence, eros and agape, otherworldly and thisworldly, that spiritual machines, in the very broadest sense, are working with overcoming. And I think that's one of the reasons that the spiritual machinery, again, as we're discussing the term, is going to, herald a real sort of breakthrough in a marriage of science and religion. And in some of the ways that you're talking about with Dowd, for example.
Exactly. Yes, I agree.
Yeah. Extraordinary events and extraordinary unfoldings happening right now. Let me, if you don't mind, being very generous with your time, but I wanted to just talk about your blog on spiritual robots replacing humanity by 2100.
Mm-hmm.
And just to briefly look at these, in April 2000, Douglas Hofstadter, Gödel, Escher, Bach organized a conference at Stanford University to discuss the question, will spiritual robots replace humanity by 2100? Among the participants were Bill Joy, Ray Kurzweil, Hans Moravec, John Hall, and myself. The question was serious. I chose to answer the question by examining each word in the question, starting at the end. And so moving to some of those last definitions. One is humanity, and the central question coming as we advance into this age of spiritual machines is, what is humanity? And you've written on this quite a bit as well, that every new discovery in science, almost every day, brings some sort of invention or creation that changes the very notion of what it is to be human. And that's a central aspect of life today.
Yeah, it's things as simple as just last week, the computer finally beating a professional Go player.
Yeah.
Had long ago beaten most chess players, but Go having so many more degrees of freedom and possibilities was considered by many Go players as, again, playing a distinctly human act that computers would not be able to, because it kind of required pattern recognition and almost intuition. But, it's in a term that I call Turinged. All these things get Turinged, meaning that they get beaten, overtaken by computers. Go has gotten that. So suddenly, in the list of things that make us human, we have to cross off can play Go.
Right.
And we have a long list that keeps getting shorter and shorter. And so the list of things that we think are distinctly and uniquely human is a list that is constantly having things crossed off. And that's at one level. And at the other level, we have inventions like, gene therapy and other cloning technology. And so if we can make clones, if we're not so unique, if there's 500 copies of me, what does that say about my humanity?
Right.
And let alone the fact that we've had twins forever, but people are spooked out by that, and it forces them to redefine it. But even smaller things like Second Life, where we have online worlds and people have their own identity, and maybe they're going to do some bending of the gender, and all these things have impact on our own conception and identity of ourselves. And so, and so there's hardly a day go by when our sense of who we are is not being challenged. Right.
And you also point out in one of the blogs that this is just increasing and is becoming more and more central, and also more and more something that affects the common person, such that you'll start to see headlines on CNN and on the New York Times and on the evening news about what is it to be human, and here's another discovery, another take, another version, another chink in our definition of humanity that just fell off the board.
Right.
And that's going to continue to increase.
And it's also, I have to say, it's not, by the way, not just sort of the uneducated or uninformed. I mean, there will come a time, not in our lifetimes, but there will come a time, maybe this century, when we might fork the genetic lines of humans. In other words, there might be people who, for religious or other reasons, believe that there's under no circumstances should we ever alter the human genome. And there'll be others who are going to be very ready to fiddle with and enhance and do whatever. And there may come a time when we have more than one species, so to speak, or more than one path. So it's no longer just sort of academic, and it's not just about the people who are slow. This will be a central question.
Yeah. And as these robots come into being and continue to change the definition of what human is, then we're going to see, again, robots with placards, am I a child of God? and others with placards, cogito ergo sum. And it's going to become a very, very wild evening news under that. For robots, you write, in general, I like Hans Moravic's formulation that these are our children. How does one raise children? You train them for the inevitable letting go. If our children never left our control, we'd not only be disappointed, but would be out of control of its maker. So it will be with our mind's children, the robots. Is there a parent with a teenager who is not concerned, who does not have a bit of worry? It took us a long time to realize that the power of a technology is proportional to its inherent out-of-controlness, its inherent ability to surprise and be generative. In fact, unless we can worry about a technology, it's not revolutionary enough. Powerful technology demands responsibility. With the generative power of robots, we need heavy-duty responsibility. We should be aiming to train our robotic children to be good citizens. That means instilling in them values so they can make responsible decisions as we let them go. And that's a profound point, and one that's going to, starting today, increasingly occupy us into the future, isn't it?
Yes, and I have to confess that we collectively don't have a very good set of tools to manage particularly the self-replicating technologies. These are the four types of technology that someone like Bill Joy and others have written about that we should be worried about, and we, in some senses, should be worried about anything that can self-replicate, because what happens with self-replication is that it very quickly, through compounding leverage, can just veer away. If things are doubling all the time, it can go very fast, and the faster to go, the faster off course it can go. And so if you have things like robots making robots, if you have genetic therapy and cloning being reproduced biologically, if you have nano gadgets that are replicating, anything where you have replication and recursiveness, these systems are going to be very hard to put in guidance, let alone control. I'm not trying to control them. We're trying to train them. We're trying to guide them. And we don't have a very large set of tools yet, but we can. We know how to train children. Yeah. We know that we have an existence proof. Yeah. That this can happen. Yeah. And so I think that's where we want to spend our focus on, rather than trying to prohibit technologies, which never works. Right. Prohibition in technologies like censorship on the net, things just route around it. And so right now we have basically one answer to things that we don't like, which is no. Yep. And that's not a good answer. What we want to do is to say, well, kind of like children, how about this? We'll find a different place for you. We'll try and match what you can do, and we'll work with the technology as we would work with children. Right. And that's something that needs to particularly be absorbed by, understood by, addressed by individuals who are working on the leading edge of these grand technologies, these self-replicating technologies. Right. And that's something that you don't see happening as much as it should. No, we don't. Yeah. And I think part of that is educational process, but part of it is because there's not a lot of role models, and the typical ordinary human response to something that is sort of harming us is to prohibit it. Right. And I think requires, again, a different view of technology to not prohibit it, but to try and relocate it is how I might say. And, and I think part of it, I think even child rearing has gone through its own evolution. And I think there was a period of time when people had this idea of genetic inheritance of dispositions, a criminal class and stuff like that, where somebody was bad. You basically wanted to prohibit them. Right. And now we understand a little bit more that there are no bad children. What you want to do is you want to match them and train them and re-educate them if you have to. So we take a proactive stance rather than the classic precautionary stance in technology, which is the first thing you do with the technology is you say no to it until it can be proven good. And I think that's absolutely the wrong thing to do, and it just encourages us not to think about how to work with technology. And we have to just kind of change the default.
And I think that is plugging directly into one of the central issues on the cultural agenda in today's world, and that's a discussion of values themselves.
Right.
And that's such a loaded area. On the one hand, you have The Values-Driven Life, a book that sold something like 27 million copies, offering a fundamental traditional value view. And that has that kind of sales simply because the alternative in today's modern and postmodern world is either nihilism offered by the postmodernists or just a kind of a blankness, a neutralism offered by scientific materialism. And we don't have individuals that are trained in how to think about values and to think that thinking about values is okay and that science is imbued with values, and that one of the things we have to do is it's time to educate the Technium itself to values and to make sure that the Technium itself is plugged into the ethical dimension.
Yes.
And that's something I'm sure you and I would both support, but it's also, so that's a long way from orthodox thinking, isn't it?
It is. And, truthfully, it's also not just from the spiritual side or religious side, but definitely from the technology side. And I think where it becomes really difficult is going back to a statement I said earlier, which is I don't think the Technium is neutral. I think it's inherently positive.
Right.
So when we try to overlay choice and free will and our own human influence in the world, it becomes really difficult because there is a certain aspect of this which suggests that there's a determinism, a kind of technological determinism is a code word, which means that basically we don't have any choice.
Yeah.
Technology is going to do what it's going to do. We don't have any choice. And there is some aspect of that. There is some aspect in human biology that, the human body has certain urges, it has certain pathways that it's going to follow in general, and we have to work with that. We don't have to accept all of them, but we have to acknowledge and deal with the fact that teenagers want certain things and will do certain things.
Right.
So they still have a choice on what kind of teenagers they will be. So this balancing act is sort of sophisticated, but it says that there are certain things that the Technium wants, there's certain directions that it wants to go.
Right.
One of them being it wants to connect everything to everything else in the world. It wants to have one kind of big cloak of sensors around the planet.
Right.
It wants to have, kind of a worldwide computation. It wants those things, but at the same time, how it does those things is somewhat up to us. There are different ways to have a global computer.
Right.
There are different ways to have a global consciousness.
Right.
And so there are both at work. Both the fact that some of this is inevitable, but how it's inevitable is sort of up to us.
Right. And tweaking the Technium is going to become the really crucial task.
Right.
Spirituality. What is the most spiritual event we could imagine? A verifiable contact with an ET would rock the foundations of established religions. It would rekindle the question of God, no matter what ET's answers. I think the movie Contact is the only movie where a theologian is a star. But we don't have to wait for SETI to contact ET. We will do it by making ET, that is, by making a robot. In this way, ET goes by another name, AI, artificial intelligence. People worried about AI being an artificial human are way off. AIs will be closer to artificial aliens. That's a fascinating point. Your calculator is already smarter in arithmetic than any person in this room. Why aren't we threatened by it? Because it is other, a different kind of intelligence, one superior to us, but one we aren't particularly envious of. Most of the minds we make, including the smartest AI, will be other. even in the possibility space of types of conscious minds, there are 2 million other possible species of intelligence that the one type we know, humans, each one of them unique and different as a calculator and a dolphin. There is no reason to make a clone of human intelligence because making traditional versions is so easy. Our endeavor in the coming centuries is to use all minds so far, artificial and natural, to make all possible new minds. Meeting these minds, I think, will be the most spiritual thing we can imagine right now. Indeed, extraordinary, and has the same essential features of all authentic mystical experiences, which is taking an other consciousness and becoming one with it, becoming connected with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, if anything, my agenda is to expand the traditional mystical notion of all consciousness, normally associated with all human consciousness, maybe even all animal or biological, to extend that further into all consciousness of machines.
Right.
To say that these are our brothers. This is the whole other realm that we have been not thinking about, and that when we think about it in those terms, you actually find out that including them in our calculations and in our views, that this is actually be the place where I think that will revive that kind of a mystical view. That it's not, drugs did a pretty good job of opening the portal.
Yeah.
Traditional religious practices, they've been around a long time.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that the third door, the third open doorway into this thing is actually going to be through machines.
Right.
And, at first it doesn't register to most people, but I think we'll find that they will unleash new ideas into our culture in a rate that we're not really ready for.
Yeah, indeed. But I, again, think that makes perfect sense, and I think is something that we will see on the agenda, and it will go from the beginning to a oneness with, a familiarity with the consciousness of our children in a new dimension, to fundamentally, as those children themselves grow up, and we hardly think of them as our children anymore, when they're in way past adolescence, when they themselves are into maturity.
Right. So
we think of them more as other beings.
Right.
Then connecting with that will indeed be an extraordinarily spiritual occasion, and show the absolute need for a spiritual orientation, which has always fundamentally been a way to connect with others, with including transcendental being, but also your brothers and sisters, in a way that is sacred.
Right. Now, the one little hiccup in this is that, I don't know where I said this, if I have said it on the blog or not, but there's a number of people, myself included, who have basically come to the conclusion that the most likely first AI is not going to be in anything that's standing alone like a big mainframe computer or some robot, but will in fact happen on the web. That'll be a kind of this where I talk about the global one machine, the single worldwide computer. And the difficulty there is that given the scale at which this is likely to happen, we will have great difficulty as humans trying to understand or even to notice that. So we will be as if we will be like neurons in some large brain, where the neuron is just going to be definitionally incapable of getting the thought. And so connecting with something like that is going to be tricky, because there is a sense in which it's not going to be very connectable to us at the wrong level. And so I don't know what will happen there, but it will certainly require some kind of transcendental mystic approach, I think, to even get to it.
Right.
And and so we can kind of easily imagine, as the little scene I had earlier of robots in the streets with placards, that they seem like cousins, but if you're trying to grok the Google in the sky that suddenly is smart and conscious, but is performing at a frequency and a wavelength and cycles that we just cannot approach, that becomes more difficult to even understand what it is that we're supposed to do.
Right. And being able to connect with that consciousness is, as all of these new discoveries in the Technium do, as you've been pointing out, will have human beings once again redefine themselves.
Right.
And in this case, it'll be just what aspect of consciousness is really universal.
Right. I mean, if we haven't been talking about science fiction already, I'll talk about it right now. But
yeah.
I can certainly imagine a scenario or a story where there are some people who claim to, basically be in touch with this kind of global consciousness, and they very may well be. And the issue will be, how can we verify it?
Right.
Are they nuts? Are they cranks? Or are they really, in some manner, through some discipline, really, in communication? And I think that's a very interesting problem. So one of the things we and a couple other people are trying to, think about is, well, what are some of the criteria? What are some of the signals? What are some of the ways in which we would know if such a thing was really happening?
Right.
We don't have enough experience right now to do that.
Yeah, and that's going to be a really, really interesting story as the first bits of data on that start to trickle back down.
Well, and some people like George Dyson say that it's already trickling in. We're just ignoring it.
Yeah.
That if you make up a list of the things that in other words, if you say, okay, this is a conscious organism, or at least a thinking organism, what do these organisms want to do? Well, first of all, they want to have more resources. So, right now, 5% of the world's electricity is going to this thing. It's increasing all the time. It would want money. Okay, money is by the billions is flowing into this thing. It wants the smartest attendants. That's happening. So, I mean, it's hard to right now, every indication is that this thing is growing as you would imagine, an autonomous organism would.
Yep. And part of this ongoing dance that we are having with our own creations. Well, let's finish now, if you would. And again, thank you so much for your time. This is just fascinating. Go over the 9 laws of God. And this is from your book, Out of Control, The New Biology of Machines, Social Systems, and the Economic World. And even though the book is dated, there's still a lot of enormously positive and interesting and tremendous stuff in it, so it's still highly recommended. And it's also sort of tangentially one of the places that you and I crossed the Wachowskis and The Matrix.
Right.
In that, this Out of Control was one of 3 books given to all actors and asked to read before they started filming. And then when it came to interpreting, doing the voiceover, Larry asked me and Cornell to do that.
Oh, I didn't know that. So you did the voiceover on where?
On the trilogy DVD set.
Oh, okay, I got it. Yeah.
If you hit the director's commentary, it's me and Cornell doing.
Oh, yes. Okay, now I recall that. Yeah. Right. Okay.
Yeah. So these are 9 laws of God, and that's just sort of that's taken metaphorically, and of course you point out that there can be others. But this is, and let me sort of preface this by saying one of the ways I look at this, which is that in a lot of the non-dual traditions, we've talked about the problems of trying to qualify spirit in any way, including deny it. And so a lot of mystical traditions have the equivalent of the Madhyamaka Buddhist notion of emptiness or unqualifiable. And it's a very rigorous demonstration that anything you can think about the ultimate will be ultimately contradictory, and that therefore there is another way of knowing the ultimate rather than through the intellect. Mm-hmm. And that way of knowing is mystical knowing, or non-dual knowing, or knowing where subject and object are one. And that one of the ways you get access to that is by clearing out any typical conceptual dualistic notions that you have. And so that it's a very rigorous way of, in a sense, defending unqualifiable consciousness by saying it's unqualifiable, including that. That would be denied as well. So it's an infinitely denying qualifications of spirit so that a true, direct, non-dual awareness can open. But then it's then maintained that there are actually two aspects to spirit. And in Vedanta, Hinduism, for example, there's the unmanifest, purely empty, purely unqualifiable, purely formless aspect of spirit known as nirguna Brahman, Brahman without qualities. And then there's spirit as it manifests. There's a manifest world of saguna Brahman. And that's the world of good and evil. That's the world where it's better to be good rather than evil. It's better to wake up rather than be asleep. And it's the world where ethics holds and where practice is necessary and so on. Whereas the world of nirguna, unqualifiable emptiness, is always already achieved, fully present, already awakened, unqualifiable, not dualistic in any way. And so seeing the nature of the manifest world as sort of half of spirit is sort of one way to think about spirituality that gets us over some of the contradictions in thinking about spirituality. So the 9 laws of God, in that sense, is one of the ways to look at 9 laws of saguna Brahman, of Brahman as manifest. When spirit manifests, it does so in the following ways. It distributes being. So just comment very, very briefly on these in terms of what that means, why that's important. Distributed being is the hive mind.
Yeah, distributed being would be translated these days into things like social networking.
Right.
The idea that you don't have centralized control, that things are aggregates of lots of little parts, and rather than one monolithic enterprise.
Right. And each of the smaller units work, and you get a bigger working unit by aggregating smaller units that have been demonstrated to work, and that would hold in evolution as well, and so on. So distributed being, control from the bottom up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there is the best examples we have are things called like democracy.
Right.
And so you have sort of this the same idea of, rather than trying to have a command control top-down control, you inform the bottom, and you connect it in intelligent ways, and it's able to drive from the bottom.
Right. And then you've always pointed out that you're actually working for a mixture here of the right amount of bottom-up and top-down, and you even wrote a blog on the bottom's not enough.
Right. So the idea is not that you necessarily outlaw top-down control, but that you start at the bottom.
Right. And that does actually fit in. Finding the right mixture of bottom-up and top-down is actually a good exercise in third-person process theology thinking. How much of God as top-down needs to be present in evolution to get the multifarious bottom-up stuff going.
And where most of that top-down comes from is actually setting the initial conditions. So the design aspect is designing the game, and then the game is unleashed. Right. And so the great game of making the universe is coming up with the initial few sets of rules that will govern the rules of physics. And so it's a minimalist thing, because in some ways the more powerful worlds are made from the fewer sets of rules.
Right. And then set that design limits, and then let distributed networks do the rest.
Exactly.
Right. Cultivate increasing returns.
Here, this is we can think of this as sort of compounded interest. This is ways in which virtuous circles, good things engender more good things, which in turn are biased to generate more good things. So
right.
We've noticed many, many examples of this, including the fact that life on Earth tended to create conditions that were conducive for more life.
Right.
So the more life there was, that would begin to alter the atmosphere, which was
right.
making it better for more life, and the more life there was, the more niches there were for life. And so you have this kind of feedback loop where things are just feeding upon themselves, and that's called increasing returns. And we see that in technological systems, in the economy, and life, and most likely in the mind as well.
Right. Grow by chunking.
Yeah, you mentioned that earlier, but basically what it says is that you make very, very, very complicated things by making them federations of smaller things that work. So
right.
and this is how our minds grew. Inside every one of our minds is a little tiny reptilian brain that still kicks in.
Right.
But it hasn't gone away.
Yeah.
It actually has layers and layers of further evolved on top of it, but
right.
the basic thing is still working. And we're finding the same thing happening with software. I mean, believe it or not, at the core of your computer are basically the same code, particularly in Windows, the same code that's been around forever. It has more and more layers on top of it, and that's really the only way to make very complicated things work.
Yeah. Yeah, it's transcend and include, and is, even Hegel said that to supersede or to transform is at once to negate and to preserve. So you negate having just one or two aggregates. You preserve their functions,
mm-hmm.
and bringing those two together gets you growth.
Right.
Maximize the fringes.
Yeah, there is generally innovation, change in these extropic systems primarily occurs at the edges of things. In the margins, we see examples of this in evolution where mutations and change happen in isolated, geographically and breeding isolated corners, and then it's after they've kind of occurred and been established, then they move into the population at large.
Right.
Of course, innovation, constantly people talking about skunk works and other ways in which little remote groups or small companies are the fountains of innovation and change, and I think we'll see it in the brain
right.
in the same ways where the thinking, what we now call thinking outside the box.
Right.
In all these ways, the outer rims are the places where the change starts and then is brought into the center.
Right. And not to mention the fact that a really innovative change at the center can be lethal.
Exactly. You don't want your accounting department.
Right.
Very creative.
Honor your errors.
Yeah. What this says is that most, kind of a restating of evolutionary theory, is most changes are not beneficial. They are, in fact, errors, but occasionally an error is beneficial. And so it also says that the way in which you want to proceed is by having lots of little mistakes and lots of little failures.
Right.
And instead of having catastrophic failures. So
right.
if you try to constrain or prohibit errors, making everything perfect, what happens is you'll have one big error, and it's called death. And so the idea is that advancement is built on errors, and that the best way is to manage errors. And so one way of thinking evolution is sort of an error management system,
right.
And that this is an inevitable part of growth, are the unwanted, but it's through the unwanted and learning how to deal with the unwanted that you get what you want.
Yeah, you quote William Blake, to be an error and to be cast out is part of God's design.
Yeah.
pursue no optima, have multiple goals.
Yeah. It's a little bit harder to explain, but there is a sense in which you can, if you think of perfection as a place at the top of a hill, and you can define that in any way you want, in any parameter, that what you are kind of doing is moving up this hill climbing, they call it.
Yeah.
And but the hill is not just one big cone like a pyramid. It's actually what they call rugged, and there are false summits. There are little peaks off to the side that are beneath the higher summit.
Right.
And that if you are always only hill climbing, you can hill climb up to a false summit. And then what do? Because you're not any good at climbing down,
right,
you're now stuck on the less than perfect place.
Right.
And also, keep in mind that these landscapes are not static in the real world. They're actually moving. So what is maybe at one time a global optima may the next instant be a local optima. And if you're no good at climbing down. So what it says is that it's the strategy of always climbing up, which in most people's terms means becoming more perfect or becoming more efficient or becoming more excellent or whatever metric you have, you can get stuck.
Yeah.
And that the only way that we know of getting unstuck is to actually head towards chaos, to do things in reverse, to become less efficient, wasteful, chaotic, unoptimal. All these sort of negative things turns out to be a necessary skill in reaching your optima.
Yeah. Seek persistent disequilibrium. And
there is a kind of a larger lesson that equilibria, which some people think is sort of harmony, is not what we want. And if you're in equilibrium, there's a couple of things in equilibrium. Like a icicle is in equilibrium, and so is a corpse. And what you want is something that is not complete disequilibrium in the sense that it's all chaotic, as nothing holds together. That there is a boundary, and a boundary that's not static either. It's a moving boundary where you are at the edge of chaos, and you're at the edge of order, and you're at the edge of equilibrium, and it's always moving. So you're moving with that edge, like a surfer on a wave. It's very dynamic. You're constantly, the system itself is constantly in the danger of flipping into order to death or dissipating into chaos. And that what's remarkable about these extropic systems, and that includes life, and that includes galaxy structures, and that includes organisms, and that includes our minds, is that the ones that are alive are always on this edge of falling and tripping into one of these other two endpoints, and that you have this ongoing surfing, ongoing, kind of a roll along the edge, and that is where these things happen. In fact, that edge is what defines these extropic systems. Is that they basically don't go if they're completely ordered and in equilibrium, and they don't go, of course, if they're completely chaotic. And that surfing that edge of chaos is actually what these systems do.
Perfect. Change changes itself.
What does evolution want? Evolution wants to evolve evolution, and evolution is a type of structured change. It's a method of order. It's a change regime, and itself it's changing over time. So how things change is changing. So there's a meta level to it, and so constantly this is the larger meta level change in the world, which is that the nature of change is changing. So evolution, biological evolution itself has evolved over time. The evolution that's happening now on Earth is not the same evolution that was happening 4 billion years ago, and it will not be the same in another 50 years. And technology, the Technium, is evolving the way that it's evolving. It's changing the nature of its own change. And so that is an inherent principle of things, and it flows through at a slower rate. But all these other systems, from galaxies and
right.
organisms, are all following the same change in the change.
Right. Well, beautiful. Well, those are 9 laws of Saguna Brahman. 9 laws of what the manifest universe is doing, and what business would want to do if it wanted to succeed.
And I would say also in individuals.
Individuals. There you go.
It's actually not a bad recipe for a good life.
Indeed. And you did cover the business aspects in new rules for the new economy. Listen, my friend, this has been terrific, and you've been very generous, and I've loved it. I think it's just fantastic. And I look forward to, seeing you and having more discussions. I
really appreciate your interest in my work. I appreciate your work as well, and I thanks for having great questions.
You got it, buddy. Take care, Kevin.
Alrighty.
Bye-bye.
Bye.